Hi guys, hope everyone's well and welcome back to the Improvement Podcast. So last episode I touched on common nutrition mistakes, so I thought I'd make another episode similar, talking about some common training mistakes I see people make in the gym. I hope you enjoyed the last episode, and again, any specific topics you'd like covered, please ask. But before I jump in, if you haven't yet, feel free to leave a review and a rating on Spotify and also iTunes. Subscribe if you're watching on YouTube or wherever other platform you're watching or listening on. I greatly appreciate everyone's support as always. So, jumping into the episode, the first thing I want to touch on in terms of what or a mistake people make is sacrificing the range of motion that they take movements through for the amount of load they use. And what I mean by this is instead of, let's say, keeping the same depth on exercises like pressing movements, squats, and also things like rows as well, not getting the upper arm as far back. They decide to use more load instead. So what I recommend instead of that is using whatever load you can get a full range of motion with. So load shouldn't dictate how much range of motion we get, or we shouldn't, like, what range of motion we take a movement through shouldn't be dictated by how much weight we want to lift. It should be dictated by how much, or it should be dictated by what's optimal on paper, what's the best on paper, and then we should pick the weight accordingly. So instead of picking the weight we want to lift, we should pick what weight will give us the best outcome with a full range of motion. They're two very different things. And the reason why this is something that I think's a poor thing to do is because if you're cutting range of motion short, you're usually going to accumulate more fatigue from the movement by lifting more. For example, if you're doing a great example is a deadlift versus a rack pull. If you do a rack pull, you could lift much more load, but you're not taking the muscles you're training through as large a range of motion. You're in a really mechanically efficient position because all your joints are stacked, which means you're going to accumulate a lot of fatigue because you're lifting a lot of weight, but you're not biasing anything an awful lot, as I've touched on before. You'll get more stimulus as taking a muscle for a larger range of motion will typically lead to better muscle growth. It's shown in some studies that some muscle groups respond better to being trained through a full range of motion. It's also typically easier to keep a weight on the muscle. For example, if I tell you to target, let's say, your lat, again, a good one that I've touched on before. If you are, let's say, not not doing it for a large range and you've got an absolute ton of load in your hand because you're using a really short range of motion, then it can be easy for it to be, or other muscle groups to get involved, just because the weight's that heavy. That's really hard to isolate a certain muscle. So usually it will be easier when you use a full range of motion because you're using an actual weight you can tolerate and control with good form, and usually less injury risk as well. Because if, let's say, you're doing a squat and you're only used to squatting, let's say, to parallel, like, what happens if you don't get that rep? What happens if you go a bit lower and misgroove a rep, and you've got weight that you've never exposed your joint to in that bottom position? You've got weight that you're not used to handling in that position of the rep. Then on paper, that's not going to be good for your joints, like, because it's foreign, it's new. Your joint can't tolerate that amount of weight and that range of motion because it's never been exposed to it. Like, if you just see someone just break parallel on a squat, or someone go extremely low on a squat, like, just looking at the person who just breaks parallel, it's sketchy. It doesn't look like it's really giving them much out of it in terms of their quads. And I think anecdotally, just from doing it, you get much more out of just taking movement through a full range of motion, as well as on paper them being better for muscle growth. So yeah, use a full range unless you've got really good reason not to. We usually build muscle best in that stretch position, in the middle position, and as I've commented on before, usually when we cut range of motion short, we're cutting it short in the stretch position. For example, the squat, bench press, we're usually not going as far down. And like I said, same applies with rows. We want to be getting our upper arm in midline with our torso. It's very easy because you can't really see where you're rowing to, as well as, let's say, if you're doing like a pressing movement, it's a bit easier to see the bars touching your chest. It's not that black and white when you're doing rows, unless you're doing it with a barbell that touches your stomach. But basically, when you're performing those movements, try and keep it consistent. Try and have something to measure how far you're going. And a good way to do so is like just filming your sets, seeing where you are finishing, because sometimes you can be like, right, I'm getting a good range of motion, and then you watch the video back and you're like, oh, I'm cutting the reps really short and I've not even noticed that. The same applies with control. So another mistake I see people make is not making the most of a movement's benefits. So this is something that you get to know about over time, but what I mean by that is like not, let's say, spending time at the top of a leg extension where the benefit of a leg extension is. When you're doing isolation movements, we want to isolate a muscle. It's not an opportunity to just throw the weight. We should have complete control over that weight in each portion of the movement if you want to make the most of it. So what I mean by that is, on a leg extension, there's no point where the weight should just be floating through space. There's no throwing and catching. Everything should be deliberate. It's an isolation movement, so our form should reflect that. And that's going to allow you to get more out of the muscle and arguably have safer joints throughout the movement. And when you're doing a movement, think, what is the value of this movement? Like I said, that leg extension, the value is pausing at the top. Hamstring curl, it's squeezing your hamstring at the bottom. So it makes sense to spend time in those positions. Same if you're doing an overhead tricep extension. The benefit of training your triceps with your arm overhead is it lengthens the tricep. In other words, it stretches the tricep. So it makes sense to pause in that position. It doesn't make sense to, let's say, just bounce out that position and spend no time there at all, or not get a good stretch on your tricep. So think, what is the value of the movement? And then adjust your form and tempo accordingly. Something that I think a lot of people are guilty with is they let their ego get in the way. They're so concerned about chasing a certain amount of weight or trying to progress that they don't like tick these boxes. Like I was saying about leg extension, like a lot of people just throw the weight up or they won't fully extend their legs, and that's because they're picking a weight they can get 90% of the rep with, but not 100% of the rep. They're choosing a weight they can nearly lock out with, but they're not choosing a weight they can lock out because they're so busy chasing weight. Whereas it should kind of be the opposite. You should nail form, train as hard as you can, and lift whatever weight you want to lift, and that should progress over time as you get stronger. But it shouldn't be the opposite. We shouldn't let our form be dictated by the weight we want to use. Our form should basically dictate what weight we choose. And what I mean by that is, like, we should choose the right weight for the job. We shouldn't choose whatever weight we want to use or we want to hit. That should come kind of naturally over time through recovering well outside the gym, ticking your boxes, and making sure you're training hard in the gym. So make sure you're having good form and tempo and not letting your ego step in the way, because usually, see, if your form's poor, you'll progress that movement at a slower rate. For example, your chest, like what will move weight? Yes, getting stronger and more efficient at movement, but also having more muscle tissue. If you've got a bigger chest, you'll have more muscle to do the work. You'll have more muscle fibers and more overall size of muscle, which means you can lift more. Simple as that. A bigger muscle will be a stronger muscle. So if, let's say, you can do a movement that will grant you more muscle in a more effective way, then the weight will come. The progress will come, arguably faster than doing half reps, because you're not going to get much out of them from a stimulus point of view. And yes, you might be able to lift more at that time, but long term, you're not going to lift as much. You'll probably get injured before you manage to get before you reach your goals, maybe, depending on what they are, of course. So in terms of next up, a mistake I see is people choosing the wrong training split that suits them. So obviously, something to say is the best split is one you can stick to, the one you enjoy the most to an extent. And the reason I say to an extent is, like, the best split isn't, let's say, you could say that with anything, like the best thing to do is what you can stick to, but like a diet of eating pizza isn't going to be effective for fat loss, if that makes sense. So there's a caveat to that. You want a split that is effective as well as enjoyable. And what is enjoyable is getting results. So you want to make sure your split's effective, so you do get results, so you do enjoy it. So a mistake I see people make is breaking their split down into two little body parts. And what I mean by that is, instead of, let's say, training upper or lower, they train like push, or they train biceps, and then they train triceps, or like an arm day, and then a shoulder day, and then a chest day, and then a back day, and then a leg day. They don't need to do that. You could just train upper, lower, rest, and repeat that process. And I think you're going to get a lot further with that. The reason being is you don't need an arm day. You've been training for a couple months, your arms will grow off just lifting weights. Your arms will grow from doing a pull up, a chin up, or a row, or a pull down. Your triceps are going to grow from just pressing more weight. You don't need to isolate that muscle group to that same extent. Yes, obviously, do a couple sets of direct arm work in your upper sessions, but you don't need to isolate your arms to that extent. So you don't need to do ridiculous amount of sets on an arm day, because weight training is that novel to you that you're going to pretty much grow off just doing very little work and getting stronger at that. So prioritize getting strong, prioritize the big movements, put on weight over time gradually, and you'll grow. You don't need an arm day. And some people are stressing over like a certain muscle group. Like, you don't need, let's say, a bit more upper chest. You don't need more side delt. You don't need to develop this certain muscle. You need muscle everywhere. So do sessions where you're prioritizing big movements, where you're prioritizing prioritizing getting stronger. You need muscle everywhere, so don't stress about just developing in one area. It's like if you're making a sculpture, you don't want to like you see people. I'm not sure what it's called, but like the stone sculptures, it's like where people make them with the chisels. They'll use like a big chisel just to get the rough shape of it, and then they'll use the wee fine one to get the detail. You don't want to use the massive chisel to get detail, but you also don't want to use like the really, really fine one to create the actual shape of the sculpture. The same applies when like building muscle. It's about kind of like using the big chisel first to get the overall shape, to basically build the base, to build the structure. Same applies like if you're painting, right? You don't start off using the really fine brush. Like if you're painting a fence, you'll use the big brush that will get the most surface area, that will get the most bang for your buck, the most time efficient manner. The same applies for training. It's like just focus on those big movements, because if you think about what will build the physique and what will give you more progress long term, let's say doing a single arm lat pull down, I'm not shitting on that. It's a good exercise. I do it myself, but what's going to give you more progress? Doing that, and doing that for 50 kilograms, getting a good squeeze, or bringing your barbell row from 40 kilograms to 100 kilograms. I think the barbell row is going to have more bang for your buck, and it's going to show more in your physique. So the split I do recommend is, let's say, a push-pull legs or an upper-lower, or a hybrid of that. What I mean by that is doing, let's say, push-pull legs, rest, push-pull legs, rest, or maybe doing push-pull legs, rest, then upper, then lower, then rest. And that's quite good because it fits into a 7-day split. So it basically means you're doing push-pull legs, rest, then upper-lower, rest. So that 7-day rotation, meaning you'll train the same session every Monday, every Tuesday and Wednesday. So it's not changing on a weekly basis, which can work for some people's schedule. Especially if, let's say, you work a 9 to 5 Monday to Friday, you might like that setup. And on that topic, if you want a hand structuring your split, I've got a free structuring your split guide in my bio, which is basically like, it tells you how exactly I recommend structuring a split for a beginner, what exercises you can use so you can select the ones that you have available and you also enjoy. And that's the split. I took my barbell back squat from, let's say, like 100 kilos up to 170 kilos. My deadlift from 110 to 190. My straight leg deadlift, sorry, not my deadlift. And my bench press from, I think, 70 something to 107.5. And obviously, all my other lifts progressed as well, which is kind of obvious. But they're kind of the big notable ones that folk actually care about. So next mistake I see people make is hold back on sets for their future sets. So if you've got 3 sets of 12 to 15, this obviously depends how you program, but when I program for my clients, it's like my thought process is get the most out of every single set before thinking about adding more. And then a mistake I see people make, and some clients that I need to chase them up on, is holding back on their first few sets for, let's say, the other ones. And the reason why is, let's say they're doing bicep curls. They do 3 sets of, let's say you've got 12 to 15. Then you might hold back the first 2 sets and then only give it your all your third. But the thing is, your biceps can recover from giving it your all 3 sets. So you're missing out on effective reps. You're missing out on how much you can stimulate your biceps on those 3 sets. It's like, why not, instead of, let's say, holding back on the first 2 and only giving your all for the third, why don't you just give your all for 2 sets, if that makes sense? It's like, why are you holding back that first set? When you're programming, obviously there's different styles of programming, but I like to program so every single set, you're making the most of it. So get the most effective reps you can out the one set before thinking about adding others, especially if you're a beginner. I can't highlight the importance of this enough, because most beginners don't train hard enough. That's not me being mean. That's not me being horrible or trying to put people down, but they don't. And I don't expect them to as well, unless they've, let's say, done sport all their life, because why would you be able to train hard enough if you've not practiced that before? I wouldn't expect it. So get the most you can out of the current sets you're doing. Like, absolutely bury yourself. Like, set safeties in the bar or in the rack and literally just keep going. It sounds simple, training hard, but it's on paper, training hard simple, but in reality, it's really difficult. But basically, the way to do it, there's no magic secret. Just put the safeties up, set the machine so you're not gonna get crushed by the weight on whatever movement you're doing, and just literally keep attempting other reps until it lands on you. And then when it lands on you, or when it lands on the safeties, make sure you're not just letting it go down because you give up. Make sure it's going down because you've literally not got anything else there. That you've got no strength, you've got no ability to get that weight up. That's going down just because you literally can't. You're literally, or you're physically not able to. And yeah, so make sure you're making the most of the sets you're currently doing before adding more. Only add other sets as well when you can recover from them. So what I mean by that is, if you're currently doing 3 sets of biceps, your biceps, let's say they're sore going into your next upper session, don't add more because you're not recovering from that. You need to basically recover and then build new muscle. And if you, let's say, don't allow yourself to recover, you're not giving you the chance to build more muscle, because you need to recover before starting the muscle building process. A good analogy is, it's like you've got a hole, or it's like you're trying to build a building, right? And where you're trying to build a building, there's a massive ditch. So you can't build a building unless you've filled the ditch up. Same applies with building muscle. You can't build muscle unless you've repaired the muscle damage. You need to fill the ditch before starting building on top of that. You need to repair what's damaged before building more muscle. So make sure you're only adding sets when you can recover from it, and don't hold back on your first few sets just because you know you've got a third set there. Give each set your all. And a good way to know if you're actually doing this is, are your reps tapering down? If you're getting 12 reps for all 3 sets of bicep curls with the same weight, you're not giving your all to the first 2. Because if you are training hard, you should fatigue. Your ability to perform should drop off as the sets go on. Next mistake I see is redundancy. So what I mean by redundancy is basically doing like a movement you're doing is redundant because you've already done it. And what I mean by that is, you, like, some people, again going back to the training split, some people doing, let's say, a chest day, and they're doing 5 chest presses. You don't need 5 chest presses when you're a beginner, for one. As well as that, if you've already done a flat press, are you going to get much out of another flat press? Maybe you're going to get a bit out of that, but you probably get more out of, let's say, doing an incline press, because it's a slightly different movement pattern. You've not stimulated those muscle fibers, so it makes sense to kind of do that before, let's say, before thinking about adding in another flat press movement. So I'd rather see someone do, let's say, a flat press, or like a flat pressing variation, then let's say a high incline pressing variation, and then a dip variation. They're 3 different movement patterns, so you're going to be fresh. You're going to be able to perform well on each, instead of, let's say, doing 3 flat press movements. Like the second 2, you're not going to perform as close to as you'd be able to, whereas you can still perform well on the dip and on the high incline press after you've done the flat press, if you do different types of movement patterns. And as well as that, so you'll be able to stimulate much more muscle groups. So you'll be able to stimulate your upper chest, your delts, your triceps, if you do 3 types of movements. And if you just do 1 type of movement, that will just kind of involve similar fibers. And what I mean by similar fibers is, if, let's say, you're doing a flat press, yes, that will like incorporate the majority of your chest, but you might be missing out on, let's say, a bit of upper pec work, from that if you just do flat pressing. And if you perform different movement patterns, like I said, that's going to lead to better performance because you're not fatigued doing that type of movement. And what it says, instead of doing, let's say, 3, or let's say you've done 2 flat presses, what I'd rather see someone do is only do 1, do the other types of pressing movements, and then do another flat press later in the week. For example, if you're doing 1 chest day, I'd rather see someone split that up and train, let's say, upper and then upper again, and then they can train chest twice a week. They can have 2 opportunities to progress and stimulate their chest muscles and have more runway for progression in that regard. So even if, let's say, the volume's the same, I'd rather see someone split up for that reason. Arguably, if, let's say, you're doing 4 sets of bench press, you're not going to perform well the last 2. Whereas if you break it up and do 2 sets of bench press twice a week, you're going to perform better and you'll be able to progress at a faster rate, in my opinion. You've got double the opportunities to progress, recover, and repeat that process. So that's kind of all that I've got in terms of some common training mistakes. Obviously, there will be more, but they're the main ones I wanted to cover. So yeah, first one, sacrificing range of motion for load, not making the most of a movement's benefits by not pausing where the movement's beneficial, not, let's say, spending time in the position where the movement's got the most bang for its buck, and also choosing the wrong training split, splitting their muscle groups up too much when they can just get away with doing, let's say, upper, lower, or push-pull leg split. And also holding back for future sets, so not making the most of the first few sets they're doing, and having redundancy in training by doing, let's say, 5 rows when they really don't need 5 rows, or 5 chest pressing movements when you could just get away with 3 pressing from different angles. So we hope you enjoyed the video, of course, or video or episode, depending on where you're listening to it. Obviously, it's not a video if you're watching, or not watching, listen to it on Spotify or iTunes, but if you're on YouTube, then it will be, of course. But yeah, hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much for listening as always, and hope everyone has a great rest of their day.